this on. And oops, I've got a little message from Zoom. I have to acknowledge, okay. All right, so in planning our back to Zoom, everything okay? In planning our back to Zoom sessions, courtesy of Omicron, Owen and Ray and I put our heads together and thinking of some interesting subjects, because I did about 80 Zoom sessions in the Delta phase, and I covered a lot of topics. And I've alluded to the origins of wine several times, but I thought this would be a great occasion to go right back to the birth of wine, as much as we know, and we still don't know it all. Every time I open up a new wine journal, there's another archaeological site that has been unveiled in Georgia or Armenia or China or the Middle East proper, and they're pushing back the date even further. I read something very interesting about a year and a half ago about beer, and we know that mead and beer are very, very old. They predate wine, and wine predates distillation, but mead and beer are ancient, and there's actually been some beer residue found in a vessel in China that is 13,500 years before the present. So which is way older than wine, because we're around 7,000 to 8,000 years before the present for wine. So here we are, the cradle of wine, and sometimes Zoom. Hello, welcome. We're just getting started. Sit down, take your masks off, and we're going to get into the first wine in just a minute. So when I often start by asking people how old they think wine is, and I've already blown that by saying it's at least 7,000 to 8,000 years old, but we really go back to to the Near East for the birthplace of wine, and obviously it's very, very old. It dates from the Neolithic times, and we're going to learn about an amazing spread of the grape from its origins in the Caucasus Mountains, where modern day Georgia, not far from the capital city of Tbilisi, and over the next 1,000 years, many thousands of years, it spread all the way over to England, and that was courtesy of the Romans. But we have the very, very early farmers in Neolithic times, where the area where Georgia and Armenia are now, then the Phoenicians, the Egyptians, the Greeks, and the Romans, and then eventually the monks take over, but that will be another session. We'll have monastic wines. So this is where we are, right smack dab in the center of my heart. And it's always interesting to link grape growing to topography, because what we know now is, and the Romans figured this out long ago, is that grapes love slopes. It's great for drainage, it's great for sun exposure, and the earliest viticulturalists, the earliest grape farmers, were keenly aware that slopes mattered. Therefore, we find a lot of the early sites for wine in mountainous regions. Now, what we have to taste here for you in the room, and those of you at home, when you come into the club, you can order most of these wines from our list. But we've got a wine from Turkey, from Georgia, from Morocco, from Israel, and from Lebanon. And these were all important centers of grape growing and wine production long ago. Roman wine is everywhere now because that's Italian wine. So whenever you're having a lovely glass of Chianti or Greco di Tufo, or even Barolo, you can think back to and thank the Romans, because they were the ones that really pushed grape growing and winemaking across Europe. If you see on our little map here, the northern tip of Africa is absolutely papered with vines. So it certainly was thousands of years ago, and their wine industries are being resurrected. And that's why I included a wine from Morocco, because thousands of years ago, grapes were growing here. There's lots of wine made in Egypt, and I would love to have been able to put one in this tasting, but they're not wonderful yet. Not wonderful yet. I've had some when I was there. I lived in the Middle East for a couple of years, so I had the chance to taste an awful lot of wine from this area. But we don't have great Egyptian wine, and export markets. Israel is a country, and that is glass number 3. That is absolutely, its wine industry is booming now, which is very exciting. And then we have something, of course, that goes right back to the heart of viticulture in Georgia. So this next map is going to place us geographically with where the wild vine was first domesticated. So you can see on this map, we have got the Caucasus Mountains right here, the lesser and the greater Caucasus Mountains is Georgia and Armenia below, and Azerbaijan, and Anatolia, right, Turkey, still the 5th largest place in the world for grape growing. When's the last time you had a Turkish wine? Well, there's only one in the market, so maybe it was not that long ago, but Turkey has a massive number of grapes, but they don't make a lot of wine yet. They're just getting into it. They package a lot of raisins and they sell a lot of table grapes. But the minute they start to click over into wine production, look out. So this is where the grape that was the parent of the modern winemaking grape came from the Caucasus Mountains. The Middle East, as I'm going to talk about, and then Greece and Rome became very, very important places for the grape to grow, even Egypt. But it had to acclimatize itself to those different climates and drought, etc. So if we just look at this big green splotch here, this is where we have early centers of wine production, starting in the Caucasus Mountains and then spreading to the Zagros Mountains, spreading to the Tigris-Euphrates Valley, or Mesopotamia as we know it now, the cradle of civilization, as well as wine, because I think wine was a very important part of us becoming civilized. We call it the civilized drink, and even though we have absolutely abused it in its past and even perhaps in its present, it was a very important part of many social festivals, cultural identity, etc. All right, so the way we have figured out the root of grapes and vines is through archaeology. And what archaeologists do when they're trying to investigate something, whether it's an early civilization or a subsistence-based village or anything, is you look for the garbage dumps, because that's where all the evidence is for what people ate and wore and used in their daily life, right? We throw everything away, and we did in the Neolithic era as well. So wherever you see the little tiny, what it looks like a cluster of grapes, those are middens, which is the archaeological term for a garbage dump. And in those middens are seeds, and lots of grape seeds. And so many, in fact, that we know that it's not just the diet, eating some seeds and grapes and spitting out the seeds. Wine grapes have seeds. It's very important to remember that, because the table grapes that we eat now, we've bred the seeds out of them because they're annoying, right? Like in watermelon and cucumbers, and soon it will be cherries without seeds. But wine grapes have seeds, and they did then, which is very helpful, because the minute you dig up a midden, a garbage pile, and you find wine seeds in, we can DNA fingerprint those seeds, and that's how we know so much about the vines that they were using. This is called the study of ampelography, and DNA fingerprinting has allowed us to figure out what those first vines were and really see how the subspecies Vitis vinifera developed from Vitis sylvestris, the wild vine that was cultivated up in the Caucasus Mountains thousands and thousands of years ago. So wherever you see the clay pot is where big quantities of wine were produced. We have found archaeological sites with, not just 1 or 5 or 6 giant pots, but often 300 to 400 of them. And they're 100 liter or more. So we know that there was some serious center of production. Before I get any further, dying for a drink, let's have a sip of wine number 1. And we're going to sort of zip around this geographic area, but I thought, we've got one white and we'll start with that just to pay honor to the tradition of having white before red. And this is a wine from Turkey. And, Turkey got in on the grape growing action long after the Georgians, the ancient Georgians and Egyptians and Phoenicians were. But we also know that there are thousands and thousands of years of grape growing in Turkey. Now, Suvla is one of the few Turkish wine companies that exports wine. Turkey doesn't make an awful lot of wine yet. Their export business is worth about $10 million, which is really nothing in the global wine pot. They don't drink an awful lot of wine in Turkey for obvious reasons, Islamic reasons. But there is tremendous interest in developing and broadening the wine business. They have 600,000 hectares of vines. Now, 600,000 hectares of vines. BC has 5,000. Bordeaux has 100,000 hectares of vines. And Bordeaux makes a massive amount of wine. So if you multiply that by 6 times, it gives you a sense of how much wine Turkey could make if they were invested in doing that. It's really tricky being a winery in Turkey. You cannot market your wines. You can't advertise, you can't buy an ad in a newspaper. The only way people know about Turkish wines are bought through social media, where so far the government has not restricted mentioning wine. There's an American who's worked with a Canadian researcher to write a little book about Turkish wine. So when you go to Turkey, you can find this book or buy it on Amazon.ca, I noticed, and it lists the wineries in Turkey, and then you can plan your trip tasting what is some very, very good wine. But Suvla is the one that has really worked on exporting their wine. And I chose this one because it's got a little bit of age, and it's going to give us a sense of the kind of weight and sort of phenolic density that wines had long, long ago. I also love it because it's got a native Turkish grape in it, yakınçak, as we say, yakınçak. Kinali means freckles, and that's the sub-variety of this yakınçak grape, and it refers to the fact that the grape gets little brown dots on it, the freckles. And that is the word kinali yakınçak. In addition, because Turkey realizes that the world probably doesn't want to solely drape their native grapes, that they have planted an awful lot of grapes from France. So this is very typical of the way Turkey makes wines, which is tucking in something native or two, and then all of the French grapes that we recognize. This bottle here, this label from the internet, actually mentions the Turkish grape on the front label. Bayaş just means dry white wine. But I noticed the one that we get here in BC, it's not on there. They mention the Chardonnay and the Sauvignon Blanc and the Semillon, but not the yakınçak. Too bad. We can handle it, right? Anyway, this is lovely and probably emblematic of what white wines were like. The earliest white grapes were muscat-like varieties. So if you think about having something really, really aromatic, like a Gewürztraminer or Muscat or Riesling, that's what the early grapes were like. And if this were 100% yakınçak, it's a bit like Viognier, with a beautiful, tropical, fruity, citrusy nose and an oily weight. If we have a little sip of this, I love how fresh it is for the fact that it is 7 years old. This is not a wine that was meant to be cellared for 7 years, but we had some of it, and it's great for this purpose. What I want you to observe is the weight of the wine, right? It's got almost a tannic feel to it. It's a little bit astringent, it's a little bit bitter, and it's chewy. And that is because wines were all fermented on their skins, which is how we make red wines now. But the white wines, the way white wines are made today, is we press the grapes very quickly and we ferment the juice. Back in Georgian times and Phoenician and Greek and Roman times, all the wines were fermented for days, if not months, on their skins. So they were a different color, and they also had a really chewy, tannic feel to them. I chose not to pour a skin contact white wine because I want you to all come back for a session in 3 weeks' time called Orange is the New White. And that's going to be about orange wines, which really are the best way that we can understand ancient wines, whites that were fermented. We also know a lot of the early wines were from white grapes. And I'll show you how we know that soon. So here we have this lovely little cheeky, somewhat mature white wine, the Kabatepe from Gallipoli, right? So this is right down in the southern part of Turkey. It's the warmest part. Turkey has a lot of limestone and they have a lot of altitude, and that's absolutely ideal for grape growing. Now, these are the Caucasus Mountains. I haven't been thoroughly through this region. I've had a very quick visit. But this is where everybody in wine heads to now. Georgia is just on fire with interest. It's in the spotlight. Everybody is writing books about Georgian wine, traveling there, and it's very, very exciting. They have over 500 grape varieties in Georgia that we don't know anything about except a handful, like the one we're going to have next, Zaparaghi. So you can just imagine the foothills of the greater and lesser Caucasus Mountains. The vine is one of the most successful horticultural plant species in the world. It will grow in Saharan Africa. It will grow in a greenhouse at 65 degrees north in Scandinavia, because I know they grow them there. It's very hardy, it's very resilient and enduring. So the first vine that was used for humans, the grapes were probably consumed just for calories, right? Nobody was making wine until we had perfected pottery, right? So really the start of wine had to be a perfect storm of human beings settling down together. So therefore it was about the birth of agriculture. We had to have clay vessels, pretty well made by the time, so we had something to ferment in, not to mention gathering the food in, and we had to have a place to make it. We had to have some rudimentary equipment for fermenting wine. We had to have something. We had to figure out the resin could hold a wooden disc on top of these big vessels. Oxygen is the enemy of wine, and people had to figure out how to protect the grapes. Anyway, we started out by eating grapes first for calories, for deliciousness, for food, and then we don't know exactly when the first moment when someone collected a big, let's imagine a platter, an earthenware dish. They were picking grapes to take back to their little hearth, to their family group, and those large, the weight of the clusters squished the grapes, the juice ran out. Yeast is everywhere in the environment, right? The early winemakers did not add yeast. We just let it ferment in the presence of the open air, and those yeast organisms would help ferment the wine. On the skin of grape berries are yeast cells as well. So that would have helped fermentation get underway. At some point, someone was curious enough and brave enough to sip that liquid that was in the bottom of whatever they were gathering grapes in. And that really was the aha moment, because that juice was maybe only 2 or 4% alcohol in it compared to the 12 to 15% today. But they had never had anything like that before. And woo, all of a sudden that feeling of elation and you know, just different, something woozy, something that put a smile on your face, something that made you feel differently about your miserable existence 9,000 years ago or so. I'm obviously joking somewhat, but what is interesting is throughout our human history, we have found intoxicants of every sort, whether it's a leaf or a nut or a cactus or something that we have fermented, like mead, beer, or wine. We have sought something that alters our experience and our everyday life, makes our mind a little more nimble and open. We smile a little more. We don't notice how everyone smells because everybody did smell. And we have chased those intoxicants. And you know, the person who tasted that very first mildly fermented liquid told others about it and made others, shared it, and then they tried to do it again, replicate that, and that really was the probably accidental origin, because grapes were consumed for calories first and foremost. From the wild vine. And the wild vine, whoops, I keep hitting the wrong button. The wild vine would have looked a little bit different from the modern wine grape, Vitis vinifera. You can see here the cluster, or the photo that shows a very loose vine, or more like black currants rather than a tight cluster of grapevines. These vines, they have traced them to their origins. We know actually that the Vitis sylvestris is all the way to Spain. It's been found. And it probably didn't make wonderful wine. And also it was difficult because it was not hermaphroditic, right? It did not have the male and female sexual parts in the flower, so it could self-pollinate. What we did, our human ancestors who got into making wine early, was to notice a vine that had mutated and was accidentally pollinating itself. And that's quite a rare occurrence, but it must have happened often enough in our domestication of the vine that it was selected for and propagated, and eventually all of them are self-pollinating. There are 1 or 2 varieties around the world now that still need a male and female vine and then the female vine bears the fruit. But for the most part, every single grape variety that you buy, that we drink, is self-pollinating, because we selected for that long, long ago from spontaneous mutations and observation of the fact that happened. As soon as we realized that we could make something fabulously delicious like wine from grapes, we domesticated them. That is, we started to organize their growth in a systematic way. So every single year we could harvest fruit, crush it, make wine. And as I said, none of this could have happened without having the technology of clay and pot making at a certain level. We were making pot implements 23,000 years before the present, but the technology to fire a pot, to make it waterproof, and to make it into the size that was useful for wine production and wine storage happened a little bit later, as in 9,000 years before the present. So this next slide shows us one of the most important bits of evidence that we were making wine as long as 8,000 to 9,000 years ago. And this was a discovery in 2017 of a cave about 50 kilometers south of Tbilisi in Georgia. And there are 6 of these jars that have been found, and they got beautiful. They're decorated with grape motifs. You can see it there. That's a cluster of grapes, and it's a round edge of this vessel that has been pieced together. And it was a very, very exciting find from the Neolithic area. So remember, barley got us all together. We stopped being nomadic when we could plant this wild grass that we call barley and start making bread. And that's why beer is older than wine, because we also figured out that we could ferment something from it. So barley got us sedentary, right? So we stopped being nomadic tribes. We could all settle down together. And then, we started to perfect agriculture. So agriculture got us into a sedentary, settled position. Then we were able to we started to domesticate animals. We've planted grapes, and the pottery got to the level where we could make a waterproof vessel that we could ferment and age wine in. It's a very, very beautiful pot. And the residue, they're not all intact. They had to be pieced together. But scientists have scraped residue from inside and carbon dated it. And the dig looks like this. And 6 of the vessels have been found. Unbelievably exciting. And of course, there are now hundreds of similar caves that have been unearthed all over this part of the world. This one is actually in Sicily, because this was right in the path of the Phoenicians taking vines all the way across to southern Spain. Now, let's talk about the Phoenicians, because we have those ancient farmers who brought grapes down from the Caucasus Mountains and started to plant them in the Tigris-Euphrates Valley. If any of you have been to the Middle East, you know that it's not all sand and desert. That's what I thought before I went there. And then you realize that there are mountains and there's a lot of green stuff and things grow and there's rain. So you can absolutely imagine that in the right areas, coastal areas, foothills of mountains, high elevation, it was possible to grow the grape. And remember, we can grow this grape anywhere. The middle of Australia, Saharan Africa, etc. So the next group that's very important in taking the wine across the Mediterranean are the Phoenicians. And the Phoenicians were a very important group of energetic and aggressive mercantile people, right? They were enthusiastic and creative traders, and they started plying wine along the Mediterranean, and not just wine, but taking grapes as well eventually. So they colonized the Mediterranean, and they also took all kinds of other goods, olives and oil and grapes and grain that was being grown in Mesopotamia. And we wouldn't have had the spread of vines and wines without the ancient Phoenicians. And they did not invent the Venetian blind, as one of my students asked me once. So in this map, you can see that right above this area here, is where Georgia is and the Caucasus Mountains. And, by the time we reach 1500 years before the present, we've got, we're full into life in Mesopotamia. And the Phoenicians start to take the vine all the way down to Egypt and then eventually across the Mediterranean. Egypt, which is very sandy, all along the Nile, they found places where the vine could be cultivated. The temperature is an issue for wine quality. Most wine was always made underground, which is why caves are where we find these early wineries, these massive pots that I'll show you in a moment, the earth dug up, the pots buried, because we figured out long ago that the constant underground temperature is around 10 degrees Celsius, and that's absolutely perfect for fermentation and for storing wine safely so that it doesn't oxidize and it's going to vinegarize very quickly. Old wine would not have tasted delicious. It would have been a bit like balsamic vinegar because it was always vinegarized. Later, we got better at keeping oxygen away from it and prolonging that vinegarization phase, but it was often sweet and it was often very, very tangy and of all colors, from white to brown to red to something pinkish. In Egypt, the wine was probably also baked because they didn't have the same kind of environment for storing the wine as well as other areas. So the Phoenicians, massively important. And I'll talk about the Greeks in a minute, but I love this map because it shows us, here's the Caucasus Mountains, the home of the ancient vine and the cradle of wine proper. But you can see the green, all of the green spread is where the Phoenicians took wine, and that is the northern tip of Africa, the southern tip of Spain, and you can see Sicily here, right, where we found very, very old evidence of winemaking. Now, the Greeks that followed right on the heels of the Phoenicians, you can see the blue areas because the Greeks were very, very busy also growing grapes, trading wine, and all the way across to France, of course, right? The Greeks were the very first to introduce wine and then the vine to France. The Phoenicians had these flat bottom boats. I'm going to show you some pictures of amphora in a moment, but you can see some here on the dock waiting to be loaded into this beautiful, you know, sort of square rigged Phoenician boat. And they filled the bottom with sand, and the amphora were pointed. They didn't have a flat bottom, so they didn't stand up. And the point was, the tip of the amphora is something that you could just wiggle into the sand, and that would keep them upright on their trip, you know, all the way along the Mediterranean. So that's how wine was stored and then transported. And the Phoenicians had a very, very busy trade route all the way over to southern Spain. We also know that a lot of these boats foundered, they flipped, they were overturned, they encountered heavy seas. And that's actually how we know an awful lot about wine, about the amphora, about what was inside them, about the markings, is that there are hundreds of thousands of bits of amphora because the Phoenicians, as great sailors as they were, the boats seemed to sink a lot. And so we have found amazing caches of amphora all the way along the Mediterranean, north and south sides, that have taught us an awful lot about wine, what was in these, the markings. We know that very, very early on, people started to put their names into the amphora that their wine went into. So early labeling, the vintages were put on, the regions themselves. And by the time the Egyptians are in the wine business, they're telling us all the information we wanted to know about provenance, who made the wine, when you should open it, what grapes were in there through their hieroglyphics. So it's been a fascinating discovery. Look at this. Wouldn't you love to come across one of those little caches? Sometimes there's wine, they're sealed. And this is what has inspired people to actually bury bottles in cages underwater. And there are many, many countries that have. South Africans love to do this, put crates of wine in a shark cage. Hamilton Russell does this and just drop it off in the Hermanus in Walker Bay. There's wine that's gone up to the space station now, you might have heard, but an awful lot of wine gets aged underwater for the purposes of science. We're going to taste the Georgian wine in just a second, but a little word about the Egyptians. Oh, if you are, Ray can top you up if you need it. A little bit more at wine number 2. I did invite you to start, and so you should have. So remember, the vines were not native to Mesopotamia nor to Egypt. So they were brought down, and for the 30 dynastic periods, wine was made in Egypt. Obviously, 3 of them were very, very important. What's great about the Egyptians is they illustrated every aspect of their everyday life. And so we know from beautiful tomb paintings and wall friezes, exactly what they did with the vines and who did it. So pictures, we also know that appellations were established. They figured out that some areas were better at growing grapes and the soil was better and the aspect was better, and precise labeling was something that they did. Actually, this amphora here, I tried to find a close-up, but this lid is covered in hieroglyphics that tell you the story, the origin of the wine inside it. This is one of the great illustrations. It's part of a panorama of all of the phases of making wine. They actually brought in Nubian people from Africa to do an awful lot of the work, slaves, if you will. And you can see from this picture that the vine is organized, right? We were taking the canes and training them in a way that would give exposure of the leaf and the cluster of grapes to the sun, and make it easier to pick as well. You can see that, you know, these people are 5 to 6 feet tall. They're above their heads, so this is quite a big enterprise. Very, very early vine training would have been using a tree, using a natural trellis to help train the vine along. The vine is a climbing plant, so it was very easy to do this. But at some point, they probably figured out if we put some posts in the ground, we don't need the trees, and therefore we don't have shade. We've got more sun exposure. We can have a bigger crop of vines. And we know that the Egyptians were the earliest people to start really thinking about the finer aspects of grape farming, of viticulture. They probably fussed about ripeness levels as well, tasting the grape, making sure that there was enough sweetness in there. You can see that in this case, it looks like this is a red grape or a black grape, but there's some drawings where the grapes are very, very clearly white, right? They're yellow bits of pigmentation rather than red. We can see from this one, you can see the picking here, but we also see how the grapes are trodden by foot, and the people who are treading the grapes have got handles to hold on to so they don't slip and crack their skulls open. We also see a picture, I think that's in the next one, where they're putting the grapes into some fabric, a tourniquet, if you will, and squeezing it. They hadn't invented the Archimedes screw. There was no press then, that came later. So they just put it into some kind of hemp, wound it up, squeezed it so that the juice came out. The earlier wine, all of the grapes would have been put into the big, big clay vessels. Somebody would have got in there, some child, swished them, and then allowed the grapes to ferment on the skins. The Egyptians were figuring out, you know, how to get the juice out without the skins and the pips, etc. So this is a fantastic picture showing, you know, eventually the amphora going to market. You can see here the ducks, the amphora heading for the boats to go and trade and sell and barter. Here is the picture where they're actually in the little trough, holding on to their supports and foot treading the grapes that they are there then going to squeeze the juice out of. It's absolutely fantastic. The discovery of these has just opened up our world to ancient wine, and there was a lot of it. You can see the production level, right? The massive numbers of wine. Okay, so let's move on to wine number 2. And I hope you have a little snippet of it left. So this is our Georgian wine. And there are about 4 Georgian wines that we can buy in the province. And I chose the one that is the most traditional. When you go to Russia, to Georgia, to Armenia, you drink a lot of red wine, and you also drink a lot of deeply colored wine. This will stain and never come out because of the grape variety it's made from, called Zaparaghi. But first let's smell it. very grapey. Right? It just has, you imagine opening a jar of, Welch's grape jelly, or having some grape juice or Manischewitz, right? Some kosher wine. And it just has that wonderful dark black, grapey, curranty, jammy smell to it. A little bit spicy as well. Let's have a sip. What you notice about this is it's unbelievably acidic. It's really sharp and sour and malic and tart. And is there a little sugar in this wine? Mm-hmm. Yes, it has a little bit of residual sweetness as well, because that's how they liked it. Now we tend to ferment all wine to dryness because we tend to drink dry wine. In the ancient days, we just let the yeast ferment until they were done, till they were spent, and the wine was probably not fermented to dryness. Yeast were not strong enough to do that. Now we culture yeast. We have engineered them to work in a very sugary environment and to metabolize all of the sugar to result in a dry wine like our Cabernet or Chardonnay or Sauvignon Blanc. Wild yeast will only ferment to 5 or 6 or 7% alcohol, unless we culture them and help them along by selecting those ones that are good at working in a sweeter or more alcoholic environment. So early wine probably had a lot of sweetness to it, just like this. This is such a replicate of an ancient wine. Deep in color, really acidic grapes, like the grape Zaparaghi, and some sweetness, but it's nicely balanced, isn't it? It's not, you're not dying from the 35 odd grams of residual sugar per liter, and they still favor this style of wine in this part of the world, and it's wonderful because it works really well with the food. Imagine having really robust food that also has a lot of seasoning. You need a wine that's got this kind of presence of flavor with that little bit of sugar. The sweetness vanishes and it's absolutely delicious. Personally, I love this. I love it. When I first tasted my first Georgian wine, I said, sign me up. So the grape is Zaparaghi, and Zaparaghi is an ancient grape, and most ampelographers believe that it's also a pretty good indication of what the wild grape was like. If you try this with a little bit of salty salami, maybe the one that's nice and fatty, or does the middle one have a bit of spice in it? It looks like it's got.
I just trying to find the bottom one that has a bit of pepper in it.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So the peppery one there, we've got duck noisette. We have some calabrese, which I think is the one in the middle, and then we have some beef braseola. Which is the one on the top, the one that's folded, right? This is the braseola, this is the calabrese, and this is the duck noisette.
What's the alcohol content?
So this is, I meant to write that down. Is it on the tasting sheet?
No.
Okay, it's 12%. Sorry about that. It's 12%. So you can imagine how ripe the grapes were to get a wine that's 12% alcohol by volume and still has all the sugar in it. So the way they do that is they let it ferment for about a week or so, and then they cool the wine down to make the yeast completely inactive because they're too cold to work. They filter it, and then they bottle the wine. What do you think of this? I think interesting is the right word. We wouldn't call this an outstandingly complex wine. It's really grapey in the mouth as well. It's like grape juice with a little bit of alcohol, but it's also tannic. Right? You can feel the tannins drying out the mouth. This is, if we had this on the list, it would be $37 or so. It's $20 in the store. And there's several that you can buy like this. And there's a lovely one called vinous from Armenia as well. But if you think about it, There are very, very popular wines in the market now that go by the name of Apothic and Diabolica and even Yellowtail that have 20 grams of residual sugar in them. So maybe what is old is new again, and we realize that we actually do like a little fruitiness in our wine. Now, what's fabulous about Zaparaghi is that there's a lot of it in Georgia and Armenia and parts of modern day Russia, and very old vines as well. It's always this violent fuchsia in color, and it's a grape that we call a teinturier, or a staining grape. And there are a couple of grapes that are used to beef up the color of other wines. Most grape juice, whether it is a white grape or a pink grape or a red grape, the juice is clear. But there's a handful of vines where the juice is actually deeply, deeply colored. And the flesh of Zaparaghi, as you can see in this little illustration, is really pink and the juice is dark. Alicante Boucher is like this as well. And that's why you don't spill this on your white disco pants or your fine white linen tablecloth, because it's not coming out. Georgia, with the spotlight on this country and, you know, thousands of sommeliers and wine critics and professors flying there pre-pandemic to taste the wine and learn more, they are resurrecting the industry. They're making everything in Crevry, their big old vats, and we're learning about those 500 odd native grape varieties that they have in Georgia. And many articles have been written like this one, saying Zaparaghi, the next cult grape, and we will see it planted around the world. It's already traveling. It's not a super high quality grape. So it's going to have, you know, it's going to have a ceiling, but it's also of great interest to us for many reasons. This wine is from the Kakheti region, which is the highest quality region for Georgian wines so far. And, you know, this is what it looks like. The vines have a beautiful view of various peaks in the Caucasus. And these are the caves where we have found those earliest remnants of wine, the Neolithic caves, etc. And some of them very, very big, where there are hundreds and hundreds of pots. Giant ones as well, and we're talking about, you know, 100 to 200 liters, if not slightly bigger in size. And, you know, the early winemakers were very smart. They just knew they had to dig up, they had to excavate a big area, then place these pots in, infill, leave the mouths of them open, pitch in the grapes, either do some pigeage, some punch down, get the teenagers in there to crop the grapes. And then when fermentation was over, they would let the grapes bubble away. When the wine had died down, they had fashioned wooden discs. They had got some resin from nearby pine trees, and they would affix the wooden disc with, seal it with pine pitch, and then cover them up and leave them for the entire winter. And then in the late spring, they would unearth everything, dust off all of the earth from the disc, and then lever it off and start ladling out the wine, and the party would begin. It was called a marani. It indicated the beginning of the growing season, and they would have festivals that would, you know, give thanks for the harvest, taste the new wine, and you know, ladle it out, get it into amphora, and start trading it or keeping it in your cellar or your little mud hut, and drink it, and then repeat every single year the harvest. Wine was always consumed annually. We were not saving wine. It was the Romans that started to do that, to put them in amphora and sock them away. We know that wine was made by the Romans and kept for over 150 years, planning for, you know, the crowning of emperors in the future. And we also know that they're making very good wine that could withstand that kind of aging and still be drinkable. Not so the ancient Georgians or the Phoenicians. The Greeks got good at it as well. Sometimes they were beautifully decorated. Now we call these vessels kvevri, K-W or K-W-E-V-R-I or kvevri or quevri. And as I said, what's old is new again, and everybody is ordering amphora and these giant urns again. Many wineries out around the world have got a little sideline project where they bought a couple of terracotta pots or some amphora, and they're doing some skin contact wine or aging something special in a micro vinification for it. Many in BC, right? Okanagan Crushpad does this, Laughingstock does it, Stag's Hollow does it as well. So let's jump ahead to the Greeks with my German wine spelling. What was Greek wine like? Greek wine, well, Greek wine was a little bit like this white meets Fino sherry. That's something that we have learned from these residues, that a lot of the wines had a scum of yeast that perpetuated on the top of the wine, making it taste a little bit like a modern day sherry. Not an Oloroso, but a Fino sherry, one that ages deliberately under a big thick layer of yeast. And that made them very tangy and yeasty and bready, but also gave them a little level of protection from oxygen. What we know about Greek wine, my last sip of the Georgian wine. Can you imagine having that with really, smoking hot barbecued ribs with a sweet barbecue sauce, because it can handle that level of sugar. It's not so alcoholic that it's going to knock you out like a Zinfandel at 15%. This is really crushable. I would give this a chill, and so that it's nice and a white wine temperature, and then just get set. All right, so Greek wine. We know an awful lot about Greek wine because the Greek poets, scholars, writers told us about it. The Egyptians drew pictures, the Greeks told us everything that they did in the written word, of course. We know that they proved, we know that they knew that, what time are we supposed to go to 6:45 or so?
Sure.
Yes, thank you. I think that's what we built. Anyway, good, just checking. I get caught up in what I'm doing and saying. One of the quality factors in great wine today is making sure that we have moderate crop levels when we're making a fine wine. We call that yield. So we don't have, we've got a fewer number of clusters per bottle of wine to ensure that that wine is concentrated and expressive and can tell you where it came from and age for a period of time. And the Greeks were onto that. They knew that if they restricted the numbers of clusters of grapes on a vine, they would have a better quality wine. The Georgian ancient people were not interested in that. They just wanted a lot of wine. And we know that the yields were very, very high. We know that the Romans went back to very, very high yields because they had lots of thirsty legions to take care of. But Greeks were into making very fine wine. The Greeks, only certain people were allowed to enjoy Greek wine. It wasn't as democratic as it was going to become in Roman times, even though we do credit the Greeks as the architects of democracy. The Romans were much, much better at it. But what the Greeks were all about was drying grapes, making a lot of white wine, and also designating certain places that were better at wine, like the islands of Chios and Lesbos. We also know that there was a sherry-like style to them. And this is a very typical Greek drinking vessel. So they were not into, a cup or anything. They called their wine vessel a bowl, a crater, if you will. And they were like this, and they would mix their wine with other things, usually water. You didn't drink wine straight up. That was for medicinal purposes. right? You diluted it with seawater, usually salt water, sometimes a little bit of honey, sometimes some bread dough. And people speculate that those were, antimicrobials, right? They were trying to purify it, to stabilize it, to make sure that it was was healthy to drink. I took this picture in 2010. I was having a tasting up in Drama in Amindio with this amazing guy, Yanis Haravassiliou, and we were tasting wine, and there was a knock on the door, and it was FedEx, and he jumped up and said, "Oh, I'm so happy this has arrived. DJ, you get to see something very special." And he opened this FedEx package, and it was all bubble wrap, and here was this ancient vessel, thousands of years old, worth thousands of euro. And he collects ancient artifacts and has a museum at his winery and has some of the most important relics of wine anywhere. You could go and visit Herbassou and see them in his museum. It's open to the public. But this was almost immaculate, and there was a little strainer. You can see that it's made of bronze. It's perforated, so the wine would have been poured through that to get sediment and fruit flies and things out into this amazing crater, stirred with a little bit of something. My next picture shows the bottom of it. That's his assistant winemaker there. I'm so excited, but look how beautifully illustrated it is. I didn't get to drink out of it, but I will never forget that moment. And touching it, and just the connection to the past and how the Greeks actually drank wine. So you can see the illustration here. If you were very, very special, you had a golden one. And I think this is one of the best illustrations of how the Greeks used wine. For all of the writings about their orgies and, mushrooms and wine together and, whatever they were getting up to, and they did. In general, wine was special. Wine was for symposia. Wine was for getting together and thinking and talking about refined and elevated things, about drama. And this is a beautiful, some words from a play attributed, or for Dionysus to speak himself, the Greek god of wine. And this shows that they didn't overdo it. Like, this is how you were supposed to drink wine. 3 bowls do I mix for the temperate. By mix, meaning putting in some salt water. Usually a ratio 1/3 wine, 2/3 water. 3 bowls do I mix for the temperate. 1 to health, which they empty first. The second to love and pleasure, because you loosen up and you feel a little giddy after the second bowl of wine. The third makes you a little sleepy. And when this bowl is drunk up, that is the third, wise guests go home, right? You all know that moment in your evening out where you think, I should stop now. It's time to go home, call it quits. Sometimes we do, sometimes we don't. The 4th bowl is ours no longer. This is the turning point, but belongs to violence. The 5th to uproar, the 6th to drunkenness, the 7th to black eyes. We get a little pugilistic. The 8th brings the police. The 9th belongs to vomiting. The 10th to madness and the hurling of furniture. Well said. And this was, this was a warning to people, and this was in one of those amazing Greek dramas, which were always about how to conduct yourself and what is right and what is wrong and what is just. It's beautiful. Remember this next time you are drinking. Have 3 glasses and then go home. Okay, let's move on to the 3rd glass, because when we think of the Middle East, and obviously the fact that most Middle Eastern countries are Islamic, obviously not Israel. They've had a long and enthusiastic and high quality grape industry and wine industry. But it was resurrected in the last decade and a half, and Robert Mondavi had a lot to do with that. He and Marguerite endowed several kibbutzes with money to develop grape growing. They're already, obviously, agriculture is a very important part of life in Israel. But this really resurrected fine wine grapes. So I thought it would be interesting and instructive to have a wine that really represents what is new in Israel, because they're making superb wines. Most of the great grapes come from the Golan Heights, from the Galilee region. This is in the north. It's high in elevation. They're volcanic soils. It's cool enough to have a nice long growing season. And a lot of Israeli wine is kosher, of course. That means that it is every aspect of the wine making is overseen by an observant Jew. And that's the case for this wine. They usually tell you on the back label, just so that you can be sure. And this is from Mount Hermon Winery. Wow, if you smell it, you don't even have to be told that this is Cabernet and Syrah, because you can really smell both grapes, the lovely black currant of Cabernet and the violets and that beautiful orange black fruit of Syrah. Smell orange oil in this, and violets and black currant. It's meaty, peppery, minty, minerally. Wow, juicy, isn't that delicious? Juicy, bright, refreshing, not too tannic. Yeah, and very, very young, right? You can really still taste the sort of buttery, malolactic. Now, if we have a look at the map, I think I prefer this one. Israel has defined its wine regions, and grapes grow everywhere now. The vines are still quite young because this is a recently rejuvenated wine industry, and it's up in Galilee. I've tasted an awful lot of Israeli wine, and most of the great ones come from here. Yarden is one that we can buy. You can see here in this picture the fact that we are at high elevations. It matters enormously for acid levels and for slowing down that ripening process, because a lot of Israel is very, very hot as well. There's limestone too. Yes?
Where did you buy this one?
This wine is from the BC liquor store. So this particular bottle, we bought some for the club as well, is from 39th and Canby. And you have to seek out the Eastern European section. It's a tiny little bit in the store that most people overlook, but that's where you find wine from Hungary. Somehow and tragically, Austria is bundled in with Greece, with Lebanon, with Israel as well. So just go into, it has to be a signature store. The regular ones are not going to. So Alberni, Park Royal, 39th and Canby are going to have this little section here where you can find Georgian wine and Israeli wine, and the wines that we're going to have next as well. So let's nip further along the Phoenician trade route to Morocco. I can't tell you how excited I was when I saw that this wine was in our market. I have been reading about it. I've had it when I was in Tunisia a few years ago. And wine number 4, and those of you at home, you must try this when you come into the club. That's in order. And it needs a little bit of air. This wine has a nose that we call reduced. There's a little bit of reduction that this grape is very, very prone to. And that's giving you that slight little struck match, almost a rubbery smell on the nose of the wine. Or when you go to light your very fine cigar or your fireplace, that's the smell. And the more air you give it, the more it's going to vanish. But this is a young wine, and this grape Syrah is very, very common to reduction. So this is from Morocco, not that far from the coast. It's 100% Syrah. Have a little taste. You have to the accommodating of acid when you drink Syrah from regions other than Australia. This is a high acid grape. It's a French grape. And I'll talk about Africa in a moment. And Syrah was not in Morocco thousands of years ago because it's not that old. Other grapes were, but this, Syrah has high acidity and it's got tannins and it has this beautiful floral dark fruit character. This is so juicy and peppery. Do you like it? It's a food wine, so you definitely want to have a little bit of the cheese. Our cheeses are, we have a little bit of applewood smoked cheddar, we have some provolone, and we have some brie. And I think maybe the brie or the provolone might be very nice with this one. You don't have those same cheeses? Nothing smoked?
Not spoke,
Yeah.
not spoke from provolone.
This is the brie.
It's not running.
It's not which?
It's not running.
It's not running at all. No, this is very firm brie, not aging, not ammoniac, not the way Karen and I like it. Anyway, I think one of those will be very nice with this. So what's fabulous about this wine is it is made by one of the great Syrah producers in the Northern Rhone, Alain Crayot. And you will pay hundreds of dollars for his top Syrahs from Côte Rôtie or from Cornas. And he was cycling, which is why there's a bicycle on the label. He was cycling around to Morocco with his partner, and they came across, they were tasting wine, having a bit of a holiday, and they came across vineyards, old vineyards of Syrah. And he made a couple of calls, and before he knew it, he was in partnership with Domaine de Ouled Taleb, and they were bottling wine. They make a couple of them now, and they put both of the partners on the bicycles. And this is just such a well-made wine from a very, very hot part of Africa. How many of you have been to Morocco or Algeria or Tunisia? Have you had some local wine there?
I'm pleasantly surprised.
Oh my
Moroccan wine.
goodness.
It's really wonderful.
There are mountains, there's elevation, there's limestone as well. And that's the
there's
combination that's going to give you the right circumstances for great viticulture, right? Good soils, a very, very fine aspect, but it also is hot and sunny, so you've got to manage the vines. This particular producer, Domaine de Ouled Taleb, has been around for a long time, and they have some beautiful mature vines. And here we go. What do you think of that? You can see by the size, this could be the Okanagan, this could be Mexico actually, with all those red soils, with the vegetation that looks like sagebrush because it's in that family. It's very, very cool to have a wine from Morocco, from a superstar producer of Syrah. So remember, the Phoenicians were introducing vines. The latitude is 34 degrees, which kind of puts us not that far from where some great wines are made in California. So, this is not Burgundy or Bordeaux latitude, but it's still a solid one. But obviously we need some cooling influences like elevation and some sea influence. So what is true is Moroccan wine, Algerian wine, Tunisian wine is very, very old. The Phoenicians were growing grapes there. And then viticulture just exploded when these were French colonies. And massive amounts of North African wine was shipped to France and blended in with French wine. In fact, Bordeaux and Burgundy were improved, beefed up with a lot of Grenache grown in these three countries and secretly blended in, especially in Burgundy, right? Because Pinot's a little skinny. You add some North African Grenache before there were appellation rules to make that illegal. That happened all the time. The industry really foundered when France pulled out of North Africa, rightly so. And the 1990s have seen the industry revive, and that's why, as Karen and I, and maybe some of you when you next travel to North Africa, will discover how great the wines can be. Our wine, where you can see the little star, where this one comes from. Allison, question.
So why, I'm just curious, but the label on the top right corner, so a Hebrew label and French for the Moroccan wine?
Exactly, so that must relate to another, or is it Arabic or is it Hebrew?
That's Hebrew.
It is Hebrew, then it would relate to where it's being sold or who's making it. Yeah. Delicious, isn't it? Peppery and light, juicy wine. Whoops. Now, the Romans, ever so briefly, because, well, the Romans matter. They're the ones that took grape growing and winemaking to industrial level heights, to very fine heights. If we look at this line here, I don't want you to read too much, but 300 hectoliters per liter of juice compared to something much, much lower, 61 to 20. That shows you that they were making a lot of commodity level wine for their common everyday soldiers, and then special wines for the upper classes, for the rulers, for the wealthy. And everybody drank wine in the Roman times, but not everybody drank the good wine. They spread the grape throughout Europe. They invented the barrel as well, around 100 AD or BC. We can't narrow it down any more than that. But if you look at this map, you can see how completely Romans planted grapes. And as they marched their way across Europe in particular, with their thirsty legions, they planted grapes, and populations exploded wherever Roman encampments were. And remember, wine was safer than water to drink, even though it might have been diluted, and people drank wine, even children. And you can see that the Romans, in their 1,000 years, from 500 BC to 500 AD, when the Roman Empire collapsed, all the way up to Hadrian's Wall in the north of England, grapes were grown and wine was made, and lots of it. And decent wine, and put in barrels. We know an awful lot about how they made wine when Pompeii was buried. Many people died, but that was really from fumes rather than from the explosion. Obviously, people in Herculaneum and Pompeii didn't fare all that well. When Mount Vesuvius blew, it was not good. Here's the crater. But if anyone has visited Pompeii, you've had a chance to learn a lot about wine. You might have seen this little wine bar where they've got a little sink, if you will, that was filled with wine, and it would have been ladled out into your little vessel. You would see pictures. There was a steam oven right behind this bar, steam injected oven where some flatbread would have been cooked. The steam injected oven, we think that's only for fancy bakeries. No, the Romans invented it. And you would have had a little bite with your vessel of wine. And of course, they were using amphora as well. We know that this is a beautiful press. And they also developed a Grand Cru system. So Falernium is one that's often referenced, but throughout Italy and Sicily, they were figuring out where the greatest places were to grow grapes and make wine. Okay, that brings us to the very end. And even though we go back to the Near East and to one of the earliest places for viticulture, I put this one at the end of the flight because it is far and away the most complex and finest wine that we're tasting today. A lot of ancient wine was rustic and rough and tumble. This one is not. And this is a very, very famous wine. So in glass number 5 is Chateau Moussard from the Bekaa Valley in Lebanon. We have the 2014 vintage, which is the current release. They age their wines, they hold them back for us, well, especially the Gaston Auchard, which is their top wine that they make. If you have a look at the color, you can see it's changing a little bit. It's browning on the rim. but it's holding its color. It's deep and dark. It looks like a fine Bordeaux, and that's exactly what they're trying to emulate. Sort of Bordeaux meets Chateauneuf-du-Pape. And this is an amazing winery. Has anyone visited it other than myself long ago? Okay, wonderful. It's very, very famous. I give this as Christmas presents, wedding presents all the time, just because it's such a standout wine and it's so surprising to have something from Lebanon. But Lebanon has a very active and exciting wine industry with dozens and dozens and dozens of wineries. This is just what everybody acknowledges is the best. So we're in Lebanon, and this is Cabernet, Grenache, and Cinsault. Oh, sorry, Syrah and Cinsault. There are a few other things popped in here as well. If you have a little sip. Juicy, bright, but concentrated, intense. This wine is a baby. Another 10 years and it will really hit its stride. The nose is leathery, and you can also smell the heat, right? Doesn't this smell a bit jammy? You can smell that it comes from a warm region with those figs and prunes and dates. But then on the palate, it's so bright and crunchy, and that's altitude, right? That's what 1,500 meters of elevation does. Yeah, I mean, this wine's been around for a while. You can see here, 1956. I've tasted a wine from the later vintages in the 50s. Organic since 2006, that is special. This was the founder of this great estate, very elegant, cultured man from Beirut, Serge Auchard. We lost him a couple of years ago. He used to come to BC every single year for the wine festival. And we would all go and just largely bow down at his feet. He was always clothed in the finest cashmere, very elegant, tall man who started amazing. Wines are very, very special. So where are we? Whoops. We are up here in the Bekaa Valley. Yes, it's very hot. Yes, Lebanon has been war-torn. They only missed one vintage in the 1980s because of war. Sometimes it's come very close to them not being able to have a safe harvest, but otherwise they have managed. So the secret is it's an elevated plateau with lots of limestone, not that far from the coast. So they have cold nights, and that slows down grape growing in a way. Beautiful old vines that Serge planted long, long ago. Irony soils, which accounts for that wonderful little cast iron rusty note in the wine. And jammy on the palate until that tangy acid comes and just refreshes the mouth. The tannins are there, but they're very ripe, and it has a nice long finish. And as I said, this is the brand new release of the wine, 7 years old, easy 10 years more aging. So buy yourself a few things, a few bottles, and pop them away, lose them in your cellar. You can go and visit. They built a beautiful tasting room. You can go down into the cellar. And they also have developed a different range of wines. So there's something called Musar Jeune. And many wine stores around town, you can buy the Chateau Musar at the BCLDB in their specialty stores. There are lots available right now because we demand it, which is wonderful. And we have it on our list here, of course. But just to make some of the wines a bit more affordable, they have come out with the range that they call Musar Jeune, and that is in several wine stores to look for. And when you're in Europe, you see many more of the range. Kids running the winery now, very, very special, and one of those secret great wines of the world that just take you back to the Cradle of Wine. Not that far from the Caucasus Mountains. And some beautiful old vines in this part of the world as well. Now, you should definitely try it with a little piece of meat. This is a dinner wine, and if you have something left on your plate, now's the time. Are there any questions? Yes.
So while we're on Musar here, when did those grapes get planted in the Morocco? And are they cuttings from France, or was there something there already from the 19th century?
No, absolutely. So the first vines were planted in the 1850s in Lebanon. And remember, if you have ever been to Beirut, there's a lot of French history and culture in Lebanon. They speak French, and the cuisine has so many French influences. And that's why there's a historic industry there that is French inspired, with French grapes planted.
Sure, but is it pre-phylloxera, for example, or is it not?
It was planted pre-phylloxera. Yes, the first vineyards date back to the 1850s, which beat phylloxera by about 10 years. And Serge planted his vineyards in the very, very early 50s, but they're vines that date back to, they're not 150 years old. They're old like this one, but they're not 1850 old, right? Vines get unproductive and then you have to replant them. But they're vines that are not on rootstock, right? They have very, very sandy soils, which phylloxera doesn't like. So yes, old vines there, and Serge got all the root material from great estates in France. It's impressive wine, isn't it? Is this the first time you're having it?
Well, this year, this is the 2014.
The 2014. Yeah, they've just rolled over from the 13 and then the 11. You can find the 2005 in some stores as well. So just go looking. It's all there.
And are they still exporting despite everything going on?
Oh yes, absolutely. There's so much global demand for their wines. And it was that one competition in London. This is often how wines get very, very famous, when they win, best in show at Decanter Worldwide Awards, and you're done. But also Serge went around the world doing tastings everywhere with his wines, and he really created the legacy for the winery. I want to, before I let you go, remind you that next week we are also doing Wine 30, so we'll be live and on Zoom for more of what's new and exciting in BC. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you at home for staying with me all this time. I hope you learned something new. I hope you have a different perspective and a respect for how long wine has been around. Really, wine was made the way the Romans did, largely until the mid 1800s, and that's when recent innovations like understanding how yeast works, thanks to Pasteur's studies, developing the stainless steel tank in the 1960s. Really, we made wine as the Romans did for so much of our human history until recent innovations. So, cheers to you all. Cheers to the to the Caucasus Mountains. Cheers to the ancient Georgians and Phoenicians and Greeks and Egyptians and Romans, and finally to us, to this day, our favorite intoxicant.
Yeah.
Thanks so much for you all at home for sticking around. Look forward to seeing you next week, either in person or also at home. Can you stop recording? Thank you.